Good morning. Once we all get into our places and sit down with our crisscross applesauce with our legs crossed and our hands in our lap, we'll be ready for our story. Everybody's all set? Okay. Today we have a story by Dr. Jerome Berryman about a very special family. And so this story takes place in the desert. We couldn't bring the desert into our classroom, but we just brought a little bit of the desert. And the desert's a very special place. It's dangerous and it's scary, but it's also a place of lots of mystery and lots of life. And as the wind moves, it changes the desert. And so sometimes you're out there and it's different than what it was the last time. And when God had washed the earth and finished with creation, and the water had come along, it then started to grow again. And then there was the desert. And so the people spattered all around to the four corners of the earth, and they made their lives in little towns. And sometimes the towns were bigger and they were cities. And they settled in different areas. And so there was the city of Ur. And along this city, there were two rivers. And the people lived along this river, and they settled there. And there were other cities. And the families all worked in the city. And there were lots of gods. And people thought there was a god for the trees, and there was a god for the river, and there was a god for the sky, and there was a god for the clouds, and there were gods for every rock. But there were some people, Sarai and Abram, who thought that there was only one God. And Abram would walk along the river, and sometimes God would come down and talk with Abram. And Abram was told by God to move his family to the other city down the river. And so Abram went back and told Sarai, and they got their dogs and their cats and their goats and their relatives, and they all went down along the river. And they crossed over, and they walked, and every night they would set up their tents, and they'd sleep in their tents, and their goats and their cows and their dogs and their cats would have water along the river, and they went. It took a long time, all of them along the way, and they went along, and each night they'd set up their tent again. And Abram and Sarai said, I wonder why God is making us go here. But I think I know God is around us, so no matter where we are, God is with us. So Abram and Sarai and their dogs and their cats and their goats and their sheep and their cows, they would go along. And they settled. Whoops. Sand is tricky sometimes. And they settled in this new town. And they sat there and they had their life there, and they thought it was very good. But God would talk to Abram. Every once in a while, Abram would walk along to the river, and he was close to God, and God was close to Abram, and God said, I want you to go further away, and I want you to settle, because one day you will have a family that is very important. And Abram questioned God a little bit, because Abram said, God, I'm really old, and so is Sarai, and we are past the age for having children. God said, don't worry, just do what I said. And so they went and moved to the desert, further into the hills. They brought their goats and their sheep and their relatives, and they settled up there. And it was hilly, and they settled and they moved their tents, and they thought that this was the place to be, and so they made an altar. And this altar is where they gave thanks to God for being there. It was hard because there wasn't very much water, but they settled there and God talked to them. And after a while, God said, you will still be the head of a big family. And Abram said, God, I'm really kind of old for that. And God said, Abram, I want you to move even further to a nicer place. And so Abram and Sarai and their dogs and their cats and their goats and their sheep all packed up. They moved even further, and they went up to a big hill, and there was a beautiful place near the desert, and they set up another altar and thanked God for this settled place. And they were happy here. And they had a little bit of water, and they had areas to grow and to take care of things. And one day, 3 visitors came, and they looked at Sarai, and they talked to Abram, and they said, "This is a special place, and you have such a wonderful place to grow a family." And they looked at them and they said, "We're old, we don't have a family." And they said, "Oh no, God has blessed it with you, and you are going to have a family. It's such a big family, as many as all the grains of sand and stars in the sky will be what's part of your family." And Abram said, "Thank you." And they fed them dinner, and their travelers went away. And Abram went out and talked with God, and God said, "I think you are being very special, and you're going to have a wonderful family. And now that you are in this place, I want to change your name. And you are going to be called Abraham, and Sarai will become Sarah." Oh, that's very interesting. And just a little bit after that, Sarah had a baby. It was such a happy time. And Abraham and Sarah God is so special, because he is with us everywhere, even in the desert. And they blessed us with a family. And so they named their son Isaac. Isaac's a really special name. Wonder what Isaac means. And Isaac means laughter, because Sarah and Abraham were so happy to be the parents. And they grew old, and Isaac grew up, and one day Sarah died. Abraham was very sad. But he had Isaac there to help him. And Isaac was a very happy boy, and God knew that Abraham was very happy being a father. But Abraham knew that it was time for him, was getting short on the earth. And so he sent a friend down back to his old, where they had been before, to find a bride for Isaac. And when the friend came back, he brought along an assistant, and her name was Rebecca. And Abraham knew that Rebecca was the special woman just for Isaac. And so Isaac and Abraham got married. Isaac and Rebecca got married, and Abraham was so happy. And God smiled upon him. And God told Abraham that just like I told you, you are going to have you have a big family, because one day Rebecca and Isaac will have families, and their families will have families, and there will be so many that are all with you, that are as much as the grains of sand and the stars in the sky. And so when Abraham died, it was okay, because Sarah and Abraham were together with God, and Rebecca and Isaac were making his family continue on. And so Rebecca and Isaac had many children, and they had children, and they had children, and now they are all related back to Abraham and Sarah. That's a big family. I wonder what the best part of this story is. Is it because it's in the desert and there's sand? Is it because God was with Isaac and Sarah and Rebecca? Or is it because we had the different things that are out there? What do you think? Well, now that you've had this story, what are you going to do for an activity? Are you going to go try and make some desert in a box and have your own place for a story? Or are you going to make a picture of the story? Or are you going to work with clay? Or are you going to work with your brothers or sisters? I don't know. Do you have that? I hope you like this story.